the first key point to make is that here's Lyndwood's 15th century book with the Reformation, with the withdrawal of the Church of England from the Western Church of Rome. This could have been completely forgotten, absolutely forgotten. Published in this version, incidentally, just 30 or so years before the Reformation itself in England, and all that profusion of parliamentary statutes that disentangle the English Church from its connections with Rome, theological, institutional and legal. It could have been, had Parliament not put that rule in the Statute of 1503, that this book would have been completely forgotten. But ironically, it was by means of law, by means of a legal vehicle, namely a parliamentary statute, that this book survived. So the first point is, in the 16th century and the 17th century, immediately following the so-called English Reformation, the lawyers of the newly established Church of England, if they were faced with a gap in the law, because the Church of England was a new church in the 16th and 17th century, they couldn't instantly legislate on matters that were arising. They had to find a solution to legal problems somewhere, and so the statute pointed them in the direction of the pre-1533 Roman canon law. There was a gap, a lacuna legis, as the lawyers say, a lacuna in the law. And so an obvious place for these lawyers in the Reformation Church of the 16th and 17th century for them to turn to was Lyndwood's book, and they did just that. One lawyer, John Godolphin, who was a judge in the Admiralty Courts, but had a deep interest in the law of the developing Church of England, quite well on into the Reformation actually, in the 1670s. He was active in the Republic, but he was also active after the Restoration and became a judge in the Admiralty Court. And he wrote an extraordinary book, the Repertorium Canonicum, an abridgment of the ecclesiastical laws of England. And of course this diocese of St. David's was by this time, had been for centuries, part of the province of Canterbury in the Church of England. And Godolphin in this book deals with all sorts of subjects in the life of the church, from its government, its ministry, its worship and so on. But he relies in part on Lyndwood's Provinciale. Here's a passage that we can look at, and it underpins what John Godolphin thought about the authority of Lyndwood's Provinciale. And here is the title page of John Godolphin and his book, the Repertorium Canonicum, or an abridgment of the ecclesiastical laws of this realm, consistent with the temporal. This is a political point he's making. He's saying, look, we might have all this church law. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. When our law is silent, we look at other legal systems, as lawyers have done throughout all ages. And when we look at other systems, we look primarily at the Roman canon law, because that's what we've inherited. The Roman Church is the mother church. The Church of England has been born from it. And so this book, his abridgment of the ecclesiastical laws, is a statement of the ecclesiastical law which exists within the wider environment, if you like, of the temporal law. And on page 21 of the introduction to this book, we read, because what he's doing is setting out his stall. He's saying, look, these are the sources that I'm going to use to elucidate, to explain, and sometimes, if you're lucky, to evaluate the law of the Church of England. And on page 21 he writes, among the many learned ecclesiastics who have supplied that ecclesiastical place, William Lyndwood, who finished his industrious and useful work of the provincial constitutions about the year 1433 in the time of King Henry VI, He seems to be of the highest renown. His education was in the University of Cambridge, first scholar of Gunville, then fellow of Pembroke Hall, etc., etc. And then he, Lyndwood, collected the constitutions of the 14 later archbishops of Canterbury, and he lists them, unto whom he dedicated that highly to be esteemed work, that is, one of them, Henry Tritchley. And his gloss on these constitutions, being in itself as a canonical magazine, an introduction to the canon law, or the key which opens the magazine of the whole canon law. Now, that is some praise for somebody who lived over 200 years before Godolphin. He ends this paragraph. It was printed, the Provinciale, that is, of Lyndwood, it was printed at Paris, anno 1505, at the cost and charges of William Breton, merchant of London, revised by the care of Wolfgangus Hippolytus, and prefaced unto by Iodocus Badius. This famous Lyndwood was afterwards made Bishop of St. David's. So writes Godolphin, 1678. And if we look here, in the Lyndwood itself, we can see the very words which Godolphin is using there. If you can pan into this, you recall, published in Paris, sponsored by a London merchant, and this gorgeous preface by Iodocus Badius, who was a Flemish gentleman who wrote this wonderful introduction, which is basically a praise of Lyndwood's achievement in gathering together the laws of the English and Welsh bishops, the councils, the native councils that took place, and put them into this volume and then commented upon them. So that there is Iodocus Badius, and his introduction to this edition is contained there, which in turn is followed by a table of the principal titles in this extraordinary work.